battlefield has always been a place where desperation forces brilliance, where the line between survival and defeat is measured in seconds, and where some of the most life-saving ideas in human history were born under fire, only to be buried once the guns fell silent. Tonight, you're about to hear the stories of innovations that protected soldiers, stopped mass casualties, and saved thousands of lives in moments that should have changed warfare forever. Yet, after the war ended, many of these breakthroughs were restricted, hidden, or quietly banned. The reasons are darker than most history books admit, and once you understand why, you may never look at modern warfare the same way again. Welcome to Clandestine Combat, where forgotten war truths resurface. If you value deep, untold military history told with clarity and respect, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, and it ensures these hidden stories continue to reach people who care about the truth behind the battlefield. In the chaos of World War battle zones, survival rarely depended on strength alone. It depended on speed, adaptation, and ideas that commanders sometimes approved in seconds. Medics, engineers, and frontline officers were forced to improvise solutions that had never been tested in peacetime. Some of those solutions worked so well that casualty rates dropped almost overnight. Wounded soldiers who would have died in earlier wars suddenly had a chance to live. Entire units survived ambushes that should have wiped them out. But success on the battlefield does not always mean acceptance after victory. Because once peace returns, governments begin asking different questions about control, ethics, and what the public should or should not know. One of the earliest examples came from emergency medical practices developed under extreme pressure. Frontline teams learned that treating shock within minutes, not hours, could mean the difference between life and death. Rapid blood replacement, aggressive field surgery, and new evacuation timing created survival rates that shocked even experienced doctors. These weren't slow hospital procedures. They were fast, risky, and brutally efficient. And they worked. Soldiers who would have been listed as fatalities were walking again months later. Commanders saw morale rise because troops believed rescue was possible. Hope itself became a battlefield advantage. But after the war, some officials worried about what these methods represented. Techniques designed for mass survival in combat could also reveal how unprepared civilian systems were for large-scale emergencies. Admitting that battlefield medicine outperformed peacetime healthcare created political discomfort, so certain reports were classified, certain data sets disappeared into archives, and public discussion shifted towards safer, less controversial narratives. The innovation had saved lives, but its full story became something governments preferred to control rather than celebrate. And this pattern would repeat again and again across technology, tactics, and human psychology, each time proving a disturbing truth. On the battlefield, saving lives is the priority. After the war, controlling knowledge often becomes the mission. As the war expanded across continents, another quiet revolution began to take shape far from the sound of artillery. Engineers working beside frontline units started redesigning protection itself, not by adding more armor, but by changing how soldiers moved, hid, and survived incoming fire. Traditional thinking had always favored heavier shields and thicker steel. Yet experience proved something unexpected. Mobility, deception, and rapid concealment were saving more lives than weight ever could. Small adjustments in uniform color, helmet shape, and defensive positioning began reducing detection times by precious seconds. Those seconds meant fewer bullets finding their mark, fewer families receiving telegrams, and more soldiers returning home alive. Camouflage in particular evolved from simple paint patterns into a calculated science of perception. Specialists studied terrain, light angles, and even the way the human eye detects motion under stress. Units trained to freeze at the exact moment enemy observers scanned the horizon. Equipment was reshaped to break recognizable outlines. Vehicles were covered in textures that distorted distance and size. The results were undeniable. Enemy targeting accuracy dropped. Ambush survival rates increased, Entire patrols crossed exposed ground without being seen. These were not dramatic victories reported in headlines, but they quietly preserved thousands of lives. Yet, when peace finally arrived, some military planners grew uneasy about how effective invisibility had become. If concealment techniques spread freely into civilian or irregular conflict, tracking armed groups would become far more difficult. Law enforcement agencies worried about a future where hostile actors could disappear as easily as trained soldiers. What had been a defensive miracle in wartime suddenly looked like a security risk in peacetime. Research papers were restricted. Training manuals were simplified before public release. Advanced visual deception methods moved behind classified doors. At the same time, battlefield communication was undergoing its own transformation. Portable radio coordination allowed wounded units to call for extraction within minutes instead of hours. Rescue teams no longer searched blindly through smoke and darkness. Precise grid signals guided medics directly to the injured. Survival once again increased not through firepower, but through connection. Hearing a calm voice over static in the middle of chaos often meant the difference between panic and endurance. Soldiers fought longer because they knew they were not alone. But unrestricted communication carried fears of its own. Governments recognized that the same portable coordination that saved soldiers could also empower resistance movements, insurgent groups, or anyone operating outside state control. The technology blurred lines of authority, so restrictions followed. Frequencies were regulated, designs were limited. Civilian versions were intentionally weakened. A tool that had preserved life on the battlefield became something carefully managed once peace returned, while protection and communication were quietly transforming survival rates. Another breakthrough was unfolding in the most dangerous place imaginable. First minutes after a soldier was wounded, for generations, armies believed that severe injuries on the battlefield were simply a matter of fate. If evacuation took too long, death followed. But wartime necessity forced a different approach. Medical teams began moving treatment closer to the fighting itself, creating forward aid stations positioned just behind active lines. These were not full hospitals. They were fast, minimal, and designed for one purpose: only keeping the wounded alive long enough to reach real surgery. Speed changed everything. Bleeding was controlled within minutes instead of hours. Airways were secured before shock became irreversible. Simple but decisive interventions turned what had once been fatal wounds into survivable injuries. Soldiers who expected to die were suddenly being stabilized, transported, and saved. The psychological impact spread across entire divisions. Troops fought with greater confidence, knowing rescue was no longer a distant hope but an immediate possibility. Survival was no longer luck. It was procedure. Helicopter evacuation soon amplified this transformation. Instead of rough ground transport over shattered terrain, the wounded could be lifted directly out of danger. Time to surgery dropped dramatically. Mortality rates followed. The sound of rotor blades became one of the most powerful symbols on the battlefield, not of attack, but of rescue. Commanders realized that preserving trained soldiers was not just humane, it was strategically essential. Every life saved meant experience retained, morale strengthened, and units kept operational. Yet, once peace returned, the same rapid response medical model raised uncomfortable questions beyond the military. If such speed and efficiency were possible in war, why were civilian emergency systems still slow and uneven? Why did survival depend on geography, funding, or infrastructure? Acknowledging the full effectiveness of battlefield medicine risked exposing gaps at home. Some reports were delayed, others were rewritten in softer language. The innovation remained influential, but its most dramatic successes were rarely discussed in public detail. There were also ethical concerns. Techniques designed for extreme trauma sometimes pushed the limits of what peacetime medicine considered acceptable risk. Procedures performed in dirt, smoke, and urgency challenged traditional medical standards. Officials worried that normalizing wartime methods could blur lines between emergency, necessity, and routine care. So boundaries were drawn. Certain practices stayed within military doctrine, rarely crossing fully into civilian awareness. Still, among soldiers who survived because of those forward interventions, the the truth was simple. These methods were not controversial. They were life itself, and their quiet restriction after the war revealed something deeper about how societies remember conflict, not always by what saved lives, but by what feels safest to explain. While medicine and communication were quietly saving thousands, battlefield innovation also took a more mechanical turn. Engineers began tinkering with the tools of war not to increase destruction, but to preserve life. Vehicles, weapons, and equipment were redesigned to reduce accidental deaths among troops. Mines were outfitted with delayed triggers to prevent friendly casualties. Artillery and tank shells were modified to minimize overshoot and ricochet hazards. Even the design of helmets and body armor evolved based on meticulous battlefield data. Each adjustment wasn't flashy, but it kept soldiers alive in situations where raw courage alone wasn't enough. Thousands of lives were quietly spared. Yet these successes were almost invisible outside the ranks. One of the most remarkable developments came in evacuation technology. Stretchers, portable splints, and carrying harnesses were re-engineered to allow a single soldier to transport a comrade over long distances without risking additional injury. Some designs were inspired by engineering solutions from civilian industries, but the intense pressure of survival forced rapid iteration. Soldiers tested prototypes under fire, discovering what worked through trial, error, and sometimes tragedy. The results were staggering. Units moved faster, casualties were reduced, and morale improved. Yet after the war, many of these designs never saw mass civilian use. Some were banned outright, labeled as military only, for reasons that were as much political as they were practical. Psychological innovation also played a role. Battlefield stress had always been a silent killer. Soldiers were trained to compartmentalize fear, to trust their equipment and comrades, and to act decisively under extreme pressure. But as the war progressed, psychologists began introducing techniques to reduce panic during attacks, including controlled breathing, rapid focus drills, and peer support routines. Units that adopted these methods reported fewer instances of breakdowns under fire. Leaders realized that a calm, prepared mind could save lives just as effectively as better armor or faster medics. These mental survival techniques were so effective that some considered them a hidden form of tactical weaponry. Yet after the war, widespread adoption was limited. Governments were wary of civilian misuse, fearing these techniques could be applied outside a controlled environment or even used to manipulate populations. Chemical and environmental innovations also played a subtle role in preserving troops. Certain compounds were developed to prevent infection and wounds, repel insects in tropical theaters, and neutralize hazardous materials in battlefield zones. Small but clever adjustments like treated fabrics, portable decontamination kits, and field-tested antiseptics cut preventable deaths dramatically. What made these innovations unique was their speed of implementation. Soldiers didn't wait for months-long testing protocols. A solution worked, it was applied immediately, and thousands survived because of it. But after peace returned, many of these chemical and environmental solutions were shelved, restricted, or banned. Public concern over dangerous substances often masked a deeper truth. Wartime efficiency sometimes conflicted with civilian safety standards. The substances that kept soldiers alive under controlled chaos were no longer considered acceptable outside the battlefield. In essence, life-saving methods developed in the heat of war became invisible once the war ended, not because they failed, but because the world outside the trenches wasn't ready to embrace them. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Every major life-saving battlefield innovation faced a paradox. It was celebrated in secret, but restricted in public. It worked often brilliantly, but survival on the battlefield didn't guarantee acceptance after it. Clandestine Combat would continue exploring these hidden histories, showing not just what soldiers used to survive, but why the world later chose to forget. Beyond medicine, psychology, and equipment, one of the most dramatic life-saving innovations emerged from battlefield logistics. Supply chains had always been the unseen backbone of war, but in previous conflicts, delays in food, ammunition, and medical supplies had cost countless lives. During this war, commanders began experimenting with hyper-efficient distribution methods that were almost surgical in precision. Supplies were pre-positioned based on predictive algorithms, trucks and aircraft were routed using real-time data, and emergency stockpiles were hidden close to hit casualty zones. The result: frontline units rarely went hungry, low on ammunition, or under-equipped when the fight turned deadly. Lives were saved not by heroics alone, but by foresight, planning, and logistics executed with near-military precision. But such efficiency created a new problem once the war ended. The methods that allowed armies to predict movement, stockpile resources, and respond instantly could also be adapted to civilian surveillance and control. Governments classified the techniques, citing security and proprietary concerns. Full manuals, detailed algorithms, and operational data were quietly archived, accessible only to a select few. Soldiers benefited during combat, but the innovations never fully translated into post-war civilian disaster management. Despite their potential to save countless lives in natural or man-made crises. Meanwhile, another unexpected innovation came from observation and early detection. Engineers and soldiers devised simple yet effective early warning systems that used sound, vibration, and movement sensors to detect enemy advances before visual contact. In certain sectors, these systems reduced casualties by giving troops precious seconds to prepare or evacuate. Patrols and medics had more time to respond. Units avoided ambushes, and entire villages under temporary occupation were spared mass casualties. These innovations were rudimentary by today's standards, but at the time, they were revolutionary. Yet, once peace returned, many were dismantled or banned outright. Civilians had no access, and even future military applications were limited, largely because the methods relied on sensitive technologies that governments wanted to control. Perhaps the most controversial life-saving innovations involves targeted interventions that save soldiers' lives at the cost of ethical scrutiny, non-lethal incapacitation tools, restraint devices, and even experimental sedation protocols were used in critical situations where death seemed inevitable. These methods were often deployed in secrecy, tested only on volunteers or extreme cases, but they worked. Soldiers who would have been lost were stabilized, and units maintained cohesion after the war. However, international agreements and ethical committees moved quickly to ban or heavily regulate these techniques. What had been praised as life-saving in combat was suddenly portrayed as unacceptable for any situation outside strict military control. Interestingly, battlefield nutrition also became a life-saving science. Food rations were redesigned not just for calories, but for sustained energy, hydration, and immune support under extreme conditions. Soldiers consuming these rations reported fewer cases of heat stroke, fatigue, and infection. Field scientists adjusted the formula multiple times, testing in harsh desert, jungle, and Arctic conditions. The difference was measurable. Healthier soldiers survived longer, performed better, and required fewer medical evacuations. Yet, after the war, such advanced rations were rarely adopted in civilian sectors. Cost, regulation, and taste concerns were cited. But the underlying reason was simpler. Wartime efficiency wasn't always market-friendly. Across medicine, equipment, logistics, and nutrition, a recurring truth emerged. Battlefield innovations had one primary goal: save lives. They did so with startling effectiveness. But once the war ended, many were restricted, banned, or hidden. The world had survived the conflict, but it was not ready to embrace the lessons that could have saved even more lives in peace. Clandestine Combat will continue to uncover these hidden chapters, showing that the story of survival is often more complicated than the story of victory. Another domain where life-saving innovation flourished and was later suppressed was battlefield engineering. Soldiers and engineers worked together to reshape the environment itself, turning natural obstacles into protective advantages. Trenches were no longer simple ditches. They became intricate networks designed to reduce exposure, improve mobility, and provide rapid evacuation routes. Camouflage nets weren't just draped over positions. They were engineered to mimic shadows, vegetation, and even the motion of terrain under shifting light. Bridges, roads, and makeshift shelters were reinforced with materials sourced on-site, allowing units to move quickly without sacrificing safety. These clever adaptations reduced casualties in ways traditional doctrine had never predicted. In some theaters, temporary fortifications were designed to absorb blasts rather than deflect them. Walls and bunkers incorporated angled surfaces and layered materials that minimized shrapnel injuries. Soldiers who would have been killed by a single shell survived due to these subtle design changes. Forward-thinking commanders encouraged improvisation, rewarding teams that developed life-saving modifications under pressure. Entire divisions credited these engineering solutions for survival in high-risk areas. Yet, when peace came, much of this knowledge was deliberately suppressed. Governments worried that detailed blueprints could be misused if they fell into the wrong hands, leading to strict bans on publication and distribution. Even something as simple as water management became a critical battlefield innovation. Units deployed filtration and purification techniques to prevent disease outbreaks, which had historically caused more deaths than combat itself. Portable water systems, chemical treatments, and basic hygiene protocols were implemented with remarkable efficiency. Soldiers who might have succumbed to dysentery, cholera, or other preventable illnesses survived and remained combat when the war ended. However, some of these methods were restricted due to concerns over chemical safety and public perception. What had been a necessity in wartime became controversial in peacetime, highlighting how life-saving knowledge can be treated as a liability outside of its original context. Technology also played an unexpected role in survival. Early detection of hazardous gas exposure, rapid smoke ventilation in trenches, and portable respirators were deployed across multiple fronts. Soldiers equipped with these devices survived chemical attacks that had previously been fatal. The combination of engineering, chemistry, and rapid adaptation transformed the battlefield into a place where survival was increasingly about intelligence and preparation, not just bravery. After the war, many of these technologies were classified, restricted, or banned to prevent misuse, even though they had proven their value in preserving life. Beyond physical innovations, battlefield training underwent a subtle revolution. Soldiers were taught not only how to fight, but how to anticipate danger, identify environmental risks, and protect themselves and their comrades. Drills emphasized situational awareness, rapid response, and teamwork in ways that significantly reduced casualties. Units that embraced these training methods saw fewer losses and higher morale. Yet once peace returned, much of this training was scaled back or abandoned. Commanders feared that the skills could be misapplied outside military oversight, or that civilians might be exposed to tactics considered too advanced for public use. Across all these domains, engineering, water, management, technology, and training, the same pattern emerged. Innovation saved thousands, but peacetime priorities and political caution often led to suppression. Clandestine Combat seeks to uncover these hidden truths, showing that the story of survival is not always visible in history books, and that the innovations which kept soldiers alive often vanish once the battle is over. As the conflict moved into its later stages, one of the most quietly powerful life-saving revolutions emerged from something far less visible than weapons or machines. The science of timing. Commanders began to understand that when an action happened could matter just as much as what action was taken. Attacks were delayed by minutes to allow fog or darkness to reduce exposure. Patrol routes were shifted by hours to avoid predictable enemy observation. Medical evacuations were synchronized with artillery pauses, creating narrow windows where movement meant survival instead of death. These decisions rarely appeared in official victory reports, yet they prevented catastrophic losses again and again. Battlefield data collection played a crucial role in this transformation. Officers tracked casualty patterns, terrain dangers, and engagement outcomes with growing precision. What had once been guesswork slowly became informed decision. Units learned which roads attracted ambushes, which weather conditions increased survival, and which formations exposed soldiers unnecessarily. Small adjustments followed, and casualty numbers quietly dropped. This was not dramatic heroism, it was disciplined learning under pressure. Thousands lived because someone paid attention to patterns others ignored. But the idea of systematic battlefield data created tension once peace returned. Detailed records of human vulnerability, reaction times, and survival probabilities raised ethical concerns far beyond the military. If such knowledge were widely available, it could influence policing, surveillance, or even population control strategies. Governments faced a dilemma. Information that saved soldiers might also reshape power in civilian life. Much of the raw data disappeared into classified archives, its existence acknowledged only in fragments. Another controversial innovation involved controlled deception designed specifically to protect lives rather than take them. False radio traffic, decoy equipment, and staged movements misled enemy forces into striking empty positions. Every misdirected attack meant fewer real casualties. Entire units survived because the enemy was looking in the wrong place. These tactics proved astonishingly effective, yet they also blurred moral boundaries. After the war, widespread use of sophisticated deception in non-military settings raised fears about manipulation, propaganda, and public trust. Restrictions followed, limiting how openly such strategies could be studied or discussed. Even rest itself became a calculated survival tool. Rotational sleep schedules, quiet zones shielded from bombardment noise, and structured recovery periods reduced exhaustion-related mistakes. Leaders discovered that a rested soldier reacted faster, aimed steadier, and survived longer. Fatigue, once accepted as unavoidable, was treated as a preventable risk. Casualties, linked to simple human exhaustion, began to fall. Yet in peacetime culture, the militarized management of sleep and performance felt unsettling to many observers. The same discipline that preserved life in war seemed uncomfortably close to controlling human behavior in peace. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Again and again, the battlefield produced knowledge that protected life with ruthless efficiency. And again, the end of war brought hesitation, secrecy, or outright bans, not because these innovations failed, but because they revealed how fragile survival truly is when studied too closely. Here on Clandestine Combat, these hidden connections matter, because understanding what saved lives in war is not about glorifying conflict. It is about recognizing how close humanity has come to losing far more, and how often the most important lessons are the ones quietly locked away when the world decides it has seen enough of war. As the war drew closer to its end, some of the most profound life-saving innovations began emerging not from technology or engineering, but from a deeper understanding of the human mind under extreme threat. Psychologists, field commanders, and medical officers slowly realized that survival was influenced as much by belief as by bullets or bandits. Soldiers who believed rescue was possible, who trusted their leaders, and who felt connected to their unit were statistically more likely to endure wounds, resist panic, and make decisions that kept them alive. Morale, once dismissed as something abstract, revealed itself as a measurable force on the battlefield. Programs quietly formed to strengthen that invisible shield. Letters from home were delivered with greater urgency. Units created rituals before dangerous missions to reinforce unity and calm fear. Commanders were trained to speak in tones that projected certainty even in chaos. Small gestures, shared meals, moments of humor, recognition of bravery produced survival effects that no weapon could replicate. Entire formations held together under pressure that might once have shattered them. Thousands lived because despair never fully took hold. Yet after the war, institutionalizing such psychological influence created unease. Techniques capable of stabilizing frightened soldiers could, in different hands, shape civilian emotion, public opinion, or mass behavior. The line between support and manipulation appeared dangerously thin. Governments and academic institutions limited how openly these wartime findings were discussed. Some studies vanished into restricted archives. Others were reframed in softer, less precise language. The life-saving power of morale remained real, but its full mechanics became something rarely explained outside controlled circles. At the same time, humanitarian coordination on the battlefield reached levels never seen before. Temporary ceasefires allowed medics to retrieve the wounded. Neutral medical markings gained stronger recognition. Communication between opposing sides, even in the middle of violence, sometimes occurred for the sole purpose of preserving life. These fragile moments proved that even in total war, survival could briefly outrank victory. Countless soldiers owed their lives to enemies who chose restraint over destruction in a single critical moment. But peace complicates that narrative, admitting how often cooperation occurred between enemies challenged the simple stories nations preferred to tell after victory. Governments built histories around courage and sacrifice, not quiet coordination with those once labeled as absolute foes. So many of these humanitarian episodes faded from public memory, mentioned only in personal diaries or obscure records. The lives they saved remained real, even if the recognition did not. Medical ethics also evolved rapidly in these final stages. Doctors confronted impossible choices: who to treat first, how to allocate limited supplies, when to risk experimental care to prevent certain death. Out of tragedy came protocols that dramatically increased survival rates in mass casualty situations. These frameworks later shaped modern emergency medicine across the world. Yet some of the harsher decision-making principles were softened or hidden after the war, considered too painful or controversial for open discussion. Society accepted the results, but not always the reality behind them. By the time the guns began to fall silent, the battlefield had transformed into an unlikely laboratory of survival. Minds, morals, and moments of compassion had saved as many lives as machines or medicine. But as history moved forward, many of those truths were carefully folded away, remembered by survivors, recorded in fragments, and slowly rediscovered by those willing to look deeper. That is why Clandestine Combat continues this journey, bringing forward the stories that live between victory and silence. Because sometimes the most important part of war is not how it was won, but how many lives were quietly saved along the way. When the war finally moved toward its closing chapters, a strange contradiction became impossible to ignore. The very innovations that had preserved life on an industrial scale were now being evaluated through a completely different lens. Politicians, legal scholars, and military planners gathered to decide what parts of wartime survival should follow humanity into peace. What parts should be locked away forever. It was not a simple discussion about technology. It was a deeper argument about how much knowledge any society should possess about saving life in the middle of destruction. International agreements began forming around weapons and tactics. But hidden beneath those public treaties were quieter conversations about methods that blurred ethical boundaries. Some life-saving techniques depended on extreme control, secrecy, or psychological pressure that felt incompatible with open civilian life. Leaders feared that if every lesson from the battlefield entered everyday society, the structures of peace might slowly begin to resemble the machinery of war. So compromises were made. Certain innovations were preserved inside military doctrine. Others were restricted to emergency use only. A few disappeared almost entirely from official memory. One of the most sensitive areas involved triage efficiency and mass casualty coordination. Wartime systems had proven capable of organizing chaos with ruthless speed, directing resources exactly where survival chances were highest. The numbers were undeniable: thousands lived who once would have died. Yet, the emotional costs of those decisions troubled post-war societies. The idea of calculating survival probabilities in civilian disasters felt cold, even when it meant saving more total lives. As a result, the language of these systems softened, and some of their most decisive principles were quietly avoided in public planning. There was also the question of technological acceleration. War had compressed decades of innovation into a few violent years. Allowing that same pace to continue during peace raised fears of instability. Rapid breakthroughs without slow ethical debate could transform medicine, surveillance, or human performance in unpredictable ways. Slowing down became a deliberate choice. Regulation replaced urgency. Progress continued, but carefully, and sometimes silently. veterans carried another layer of truth that rarely entered official reports. Many understood that survival on the battlefield often depended on cooperation between disciplines that barely spoke to each other in peacetime. Engineers listening to medics, commanders, trusting psychologists, scientists, learning from ordinary soldiers. War had forced unity through necessity. Peace allowed separation to return. In that separation, some of the most powerful life-saving collaborations quietly faded. Memory itself became selective. Nations built monuments to victory, courage, and sacrifice. Yet far fewer honored the innovations that simply kept people alive. Survival is less dramatic than triumph. It does not always fit speeches or parades. But for the thousands who returned home because of those hidden breakthroughs, survival was everything. Their lives became living proof that the battlefield had produced knowledge too important to vanish no matter how deeply it was buried. And this is where the final question begins to emerge. If humanity repeatedly discovers ways to save more lives during war, why does it struggle to carry those same lessons fully into peace? The answer is complex, uncomfortable, and still unfolding. And in the final moments of this story, we come closest to understanding what was truly banned, not just technologies or tactics, but a way of seeing survival itself.